The horizon shimmered, and the man on the foredeck began to smile. For 3 weeks the sea had been flat as hammered iron, the sun a white hole burning in a sky without mercy. Now, in the dead heat of an afternoon somewhere off the coast of Hispaniola, a sailor named Thomas Webb set down the rope he had been splicing, walked to the rail, and looked out at what he believed with absolute certainty to be a field of green wheat swaying in a gentle wind. He could see the cottage at its edge. He could see the lane that led home. He stepped up onto the rail, spread his arms, and walked off the side of the ship into water that swallowed him in seconds. By the time his shipmates reached the rail, there was nothing left to pull back but the smooth blue surface closing over the place where he had been. He had not screamed. He had not struggled. He had walked towards something only he could see, and the sea had taken him for it. The men who watched him die were not surprised. They had seen it before. They had a name for it, whispered below decks in the long airless nights when the ship lay becalmed and the timbers groaned. They called it the calenture. And before this story is over, you will understand why sailors feared this invisible sickness more than storms, more than scurvy, more than the pirates who hunted these same waters. Because the calenture did not attack the body first. It attacked the mind. It reached into a man's exhaustion and his thirst and his longing for home, and it built him a door out of nothing, and it opened that door over the deep. We will return to exactly what was happening inside Thomas Webb's skull in those final moments. But first, you have to understand the world that made such a death possible. To grasp the calenture, you have to understand what the tropics did to a wooden ship and the men trapped inside it. Picture a vessel in the 17th or 18th century, somewhere in the latitudes between the Tropic of Cancer and the equator. The sails hang slack. There is no wind. The ship does not move, and a ship that does not move becomes a slow oven. The decks are caulked with tar, and the tar softens and runs in the heat until the whole vessel smells of pitch and rot and the sweat of 50 unwashed men. Below decks, where the crew slept, the air did not move at all. It sat. It thickened. Men lay in hammocks slung inches apart, breathing the same hot exhalations over and over, soaked through with sweat that never dried because the air was already full of water. There was a particular kind of silence in those becalmed waters that the old hands came to dread more than any gale. A storm, at least, was a thing a man could fight. He could haul on a line, lash himself to the rail, curse the wind and feel his own muscles answer. But the calm offered nothing to push against. The sails would hang like dead skin. The rigging would stop its endless creaking. The only sounds left were the slap of water against the hull, the buzz of flies that bred in the standing filth of the bilge, and the low murmuring of men who had run out of things to say to one another weeks ago. Time itself seemed to thicken in that heat. One day bled into the next with no horizon to mark it, no progress to measure, until a sailor could no longer say with confidence how long they had been trapped there. And it was into that formless, suffocating sameness that the fever crept, unannounced, choosing its first victim while the others dozed. And there was no relief in the water that surrounded them. This is the cruelty at the heart of it. A ship could sit in the middle of an entire ocean and the men aboard could be dying of thirst, because seawater does not save you. It kills you faster. The fresh water carried in casks went green and foul within weeks, crawling with life, and the men drank it anyway because the alternative was worse. They drank it warm and slimed and stinking, and it was never enough. They sweated out more than they could take in. Slowly, day by day, in the relentless heat, their bodies began to dry out from the inside. And a brain starved of water and salt and sleep is not a reliable instrument. It begins to bend. It begins to indent. The medical men of the age had noticed the pattern long before they understood it. As early as the late 1500s, ship surgeons were writing about a fever peculiar to hot climates, a delirium that came on suddenly and turned the sea itself into a hallucination. They wrote of men who became convinced the ocean was a green meadow, a pasture, a familiar field from the village where they were born. The word they used, calenture, came from the Spanish and Portuguese, from a root meaning simply to grow hot. It was the fever of the heat. And the most chilling symptom, the one every account returned to, was the same one that killed Thomas Webb. The overwhelming, joyful, irresistible urge to step over the side and walk into the green fields that were not there. Now hold that image in your mind, because there is a question buried in it that we are going to answer before the end. Why fields? Of all the things a dying brain might conjure, why did so many sailors, across so many ships and so many decades, see the same vision of green grass and home? It is not a coincidence. There is a reason, and it tells us something deeply unsettling about what the human mind does in its final extremity. We will come back to it. But first, consider how a man actually slid into the calenture, because it did not happen all at once. It began with something that looked almost ordinary. A sailor would grow quiet. He would seem tired in a way that sleep did not fix. His skin burned dry to the touch, and his eyes took on a glassy, distant focus, as though he were watching something just past the shoulder of whoever spoke to him. He might answer questions slowly, or answer questions no one had asked. The experienced hands knew these signs, and when they saw them in a shipmate, a cold dread settled over them, because they knew what often came next. The fever would climb. The man's reason would loosen from its moorings. And then, at some point, the sea would change in his eyes. The blue would become green. The swells would become the soft roll of hills. And the horror of it, the part that made grown men weep to describe it afterward, was that the sick man was happy. He was not terrified. He was not in pain. He believed he had been delivered. He believed he was finally, blessedly home. And so the crew would have to do the only thing they could. They would seize their own friend, wrestle him to the deck while he laughed and pleaded to be let go to the green fields, and they would tie him down. They would bind a man hand and foot and listen to him beg, for hours, to be allowed to walk to his death. And sometimes they were not fast enough. Sometimes the first anyone knew of it was the sound of a body striking the water. The greatest danger of all belonged to the men sent aloft. High in the rigging, a sailor balanced on a thin footrope 100 feet above the deck, and from that height the sea spread out below him in every direction, vast and green-blue and shimmering in the heat. A man already softening into the fever, sent up to take in a sail, might look down from that perch and see not water but a sunlit valley falling away beneath his feet, soft and inviting and close enough to step into. There were no shipmates beside him there to seize his arms. There was only the long drop, and the lovely false ground waiting at the bottom of it. More than one sailor, it was said, simply let go of the rigging and stepped off into the air, smiling, certain he was setting his foot down on solid earth. They had survived the doldrums. They had rationed the last of the water. The wind, they prayed, would come tomorrow. But then the fever would take another man, and another, and the ship that had been merely becalmed became something far worse. A vessel where the greatest danger was no longer the sea outside but the minds of the men within. A captain could double the watch against pirates. He could not post a guard against the thing that lived inside his crew's own heads. And here we arrive at the question we left open, the matter of those green fields. Why grass? Why home? The answer lies in who these men were, and how they came to be on those ships at all. The vast majority of sailors in the age of sail were not adventurers who chose the sea for love of it. They were poor men, countrymen, boys taken from villages and farms across England and France and Spain and the colonies, many pressed into service against their will, snatched from a tavern or a road and woken at sea with no way back. The last green thing most of them had ever known was the land of their childhood. A field at the edge of a village. A lane between hedgerows. The single image of safety and belonging that every one of them carried buried beneath years of salt and brutality. So when the fever came, when thirst and heat and exhaustion finally cracked the mind open, it reached for the deepest and oldest comfort it could find. It reached for home. The brain, drowning in its own failure, gave the dying man the one thing he had wanted through every cold watch and every flogging and every endless night below decks. It gave him the green field. It gave him the way back. And then it asked him to step toward it. The calenture was not, in the end, simply a fever. It was homesickness made lethal. It was the longing for land turned into a weapon, and the sea was patient enough to wait for it to be used. Ahead, we are going to look at the strange and desperate ways sailors tried to fight this thing, including one ritual so unsettling it sounds invented, and at what modern medicine finally understood about what was truly happening to these men. But to feel the full weight of the calenture, you have to sit for a moment inside one of its accounts. There is a description, repeated in various forms across maritime writing, of a ship deep in the tropics where the calenture took hold of nearly half the crew at once. The men who remained sane were forced to lash their fevered shipmates to the masts and the rails, and through the long burning afternoon the ship became a place of horror, filled with the voices of men calling out the names of places that did not exist on any chart. They called for their mothers. They described the wheat. They argued, gently and reasonably, with the men holding them down, explaining that they only wished to step across to the lovely green shore that everyone could surely see. And the sane men, themselves half mad with thirst and heat and exhaustion, had to hold the line against that reasonableness, knowing that to loosen a single knot was to commit a friend to the deep. Some of those sane men, in the days that followed, began to see the green at the edges of their own vision. That was the true terror of the calenture. It was not only a sickness you might catch. It was a sickness you might watch crawling toward you, one symptom at a time, with no cure aboard and no land in sight. So how did they fight it? The honest answer is that, for most of the age of sail, they could not. They tried what they had. Surgeons bled the fevered men, opening veins to draw out what they believed was an excess of heat in the blood, which only weakened bodies already starved of fluid and almost certainly killed some of the very men it was meant to save. They tried to cool the afflicted, pouring precious water over their heads, fanning them, dragging them into whatever thin shade the sails could throw. They tried to force the sick to drink. And above all, they restrained them, because restraint was the only thing that reliably kept a calenture victim alive long enough to recover, if recover he could. Some did. If the fever broke before the body gave out, a man might wake hollow-eyed and confused, with only fragments of memory of the green fields and the rail and the hands that had held him down. But there is one account, repeated among sailors, of a stranger remedy, and it is the detail this story has been moving toward. On some ships it was said that when the calenture spread, the crew would do a thing that seems at first like madness piled upon madness. They would gather, and they would sing. Loudly, deliberately, all together, the men would raise the old songs of home, the very songs of the villages and fields the fever was conjuring. And the logic, such as it was, ran like this. If the sick man's mind was being pulled toward an imaginary shore, then perhaps a shore of sound, a wall of familiar human voices, could pull it back. Perhaps a man drowning in his own delirium could follow the singing the way a lost traveler follows a bell through fog, back toward the deck, back toward the living, back from the edge of the rail. Whether it ever truly saved a single soul, no one can say. But picture it. A ship motionless on a glassy, burning sea, surrounded by nothing in every direction, and from its decks rising the sound of sun-washed, half-dead men singing as loudly as their cracked throats allowed, not for joy, but to keep their friends from walking into the water. There may be no image in all of maritime history that captures the loneliness of the age of sail more completely than that one. In time, the calenture loosened its grip on the world, not because anyone defeated it, but because everything around it changed. Ships grew faster and crossings grew shorter, so men spent less time trapped in the killing latitudes. The understanding of clean water, of diet, of ventilation below decks slowly improved, and with it the underlying conditions that had bent men's minds began to ease. Modern medicine, looking back, recognized the calenture for what it almost certainly was. Not a single disease but a convergence, the delirium of severe dehydration and heatstroke compounded by exhaustion, malnutrition, and very likely the fevers of the tropics layered on top. There was no demon in it. There was only the body failing, and the mind, and failing with it, reaching one last time for home. And yet knowing the mechanism does not make it less haunting. Because the calenture tells a truth about human beings that we would rather not look at directly. It tells us that under enough suffering, the mind will not simply break. It will lie to us tenderly. It will build us exactly the thing we have always wanted, in perfect and beautiful detail, and it will use that thing to lead us gently to our end. The last sight of those sailors was not darkness or terror. It was a green field in summer light, and a lane that led home, and the certainty that they had finally, after everything, arrived. Thomas Webb walked toward that field with his arms spread and a smile on his face, and the ocean closed over him without a sound. Somewhere beneath the surface he had mistaken for a meadow. The deep took him the way it had taken so many before, men who died not fighting the sea but reaching for the land. The calenture asked nothing of its victims, but that they trust the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. And on a flat and burning sea, with home 1,000 miles behind them and the water rising green in their fevered eyes, that was the easiest thing in the world to do.